This half hour, Representative Dave Maturen is back with us with a legislative update this morning. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
So I have a friend who at some time, parts of the year, his business is such that he works quite a bit of overtime. So when it levels off and he's back to a 40-hour week, he makes this joke. I'm working part-time this week. He really isn't, but it feels that way. And the whole part-time idea, really the real part-time idea, gets floated every now and then for legislators. The part-time legislator idea, I guess, is back up for a little bit of a discussion around the state. What have you heard about that?
Well, yeah, I've only heard what I've read in the news entities that publish information for folks that kind of key in on Lansing. I know the Senate Majority Leaders broached the topic about a part-time legislature with part-time legislators, and he also kind of sort of tie-bar that to let's get rid of term limits too, because we can't have part-time legislators and then have new folks just coming in with absolutely no idea how the system runs. So
the notion with the part-time legislature, of course, is we pay less because you all work less in theory, and it should cost us less overall. Are there any other advantages, you think?
I'm not really sure. I know that, being into my second term, that things are very complex in Lansing. A lot of the issues are very complex. Yeah. Lots of moving parts to things, and you've got to have you've got to have some time to have been there to see how things work. It's not just a really black and white. There's a huge gray line there.
Yeah.
And I think folks need to at least if you are going to become a part-time legislator, have some knowledge of how government works before you get in, because there's just too many issues that can't be resolved with a set of sound bites or talking points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if any of you listening are in a full-time job, what if your boss came to you and said, you're going to only work 20 hours a week instead of 40, but you're going to have to get all that work done? You'd probably laugh, right? I mean,
yeah.
Most of us probably would. So you can compare that to this, right? I mean, you'd still be having to do the same amount of work.
Well, yeah, you'd be doing the same amount of work, assuming that that you didn't cede a lot of the governance to the executive branch. I mean, that's a trade-off. I believe that a lot of these states that have part-time legislatures, also probably have less power. They're weaker, and if you're happy with that, and if you're fine with that, fine with your administration running things, then that may be a reasonable trade-off. But you also can't expect to have somebody available to you 7 days a week if you're going to pay them half of what they're normally getting paid.
Right.
So I mean, pros and cons.
By saying the executive branch, we're talking about the governor's office, basically.
The governor and the bureaucracy. Yeah. And if people are comfortable with that, if they don't want to have the access they have to their legislature and to the, I guess, resolving some of the issues that they might have through the legislative process, then if you're fine with that, it works in a lot of states, but sometimes, again, the devil's in the details.
Right. And we don't know what those are yet. Representative Dave Maturen is here. When we come back in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about the budget process, which I guess hitting a snag might not be might be a little bit more dramatic in saying that than anything. But again, the details here, and so some of the details may have slowed a little of the pace down here.
Right.
We'll talk about that when we come back in just a minute on 95.3 WBCK. 95.3 WBCK. We're here with Representative Dave Maturen. Legislative update once per month, as usual. We'll also talk this week with Representative Dr. John Bison. So the budget issue is one in which we're snagged, and there I go again saying snagged when it really is just, slowed a little, in a similar spot where we were before, and maybe that's not so surprising because this issue is a little bit touchy. The whole notion of teacher pensions. This is where we're a little bit slowed.
Well, that seems to be, from what I've read, the issue that's kind of made the three parties, the House, Senate, and the governor's office, skip the last budget session, see what they can agree on. Obviously, the House and the Senate seem to want to include in the budget money needed to set aside to essentially stop a teacher retirement plan that's been in effect for 8 years, which the governor says is fully funded, and which it is at this point. The big elephant in the room is the previous plans that have been closed, where we're $29 billion unfunded. I'm not sure how to make a direct linkage between the two, but obviously they are related. But apparently they can't come to an agreement, and both the House and the Senate have carved more money out of the budget than what the governor has. So there's money there to do something. Now, having said that, there's new revenue estimating conferences come out to show that even in the current year, we're going to get less money in our general fund than what we had before. So some of the roughly $270 million, the House was under the governor's budget. A fair chunk of that will be eaten up simply because the money's not going to be there. So anyway, the whole idea is some folks want to reform the hybrid teacher pension plan.
Yeah.
But to do that, anytime you touch one of those parts, there's about 5 other moving parts. And simply closing a plan, that's not the end of it.
Yeah.
You've got to keep funneling money into that plan. And I guess the issue is, do we have the money to do that? Is it one-time money, which we certainly shouldn't use? Is there a long-term projection of having surpluses? That's going to be kind of hard to do, in my opinion. I'm not on appropriations, but we last legislative session said we're going to put $600 million from the general fund into roads. So that's looming out there. So, what do we not do roads and do this? So lots of issues out there, but you got to have money anytime you close a plan to follow up and guarantee at least that plan, the benefits continue, because we have to do that.
This, and you touch on that whole roads issue. This was the problem that the detractors of our road fix a couple years ago, were pointing out that when you leave the money in the general fund, it could end up going somewhere else, right?
Well, exactly, yeah, and we can't. You can't tie the next legislative session to spending money that you said. Well, you ought to do that 4 years from now.
Yeah, right.
You can't do that. So that's the problem without having a dedicated fund like a gas tax or whatever that's going to go specifically to that. Now it's the general fund. Are there other pressing issues? Are there other priorities? What do you want to do? But we keep loading more and more money onto that, and it'll be interesting to see the dynamics. But hopefully they can come to some resolution. We've prided ourselves on the last 6 years of coming out with a budget that's done ahead of time, so the local units of government and the schools know whether they like it or not. Here's what you're going to have. So at least they know what they're going into their fiscal year with as far as funding goes. So
Representative Dave Maturen is here. We'll pick up where we leave off in just a moment. A few more minutes with Representative Dave Maturen. So there you have it. The budget issue is somewhat fluid because you've got to juggle all this stuff that's constantly moving. It's like jumping on and off a moving streetcar or something, and you got to figure out what the curves are ahead and all of that stuff. And part of this whole teacher thing is the notion that the idea that maybe some new hires then wouldn't be in line for pensions. Instead, they do a 401k like many of us do.
Exactly. I think that's what the end game is there. The current system is kind of a hybrid between a defined benefit system, and a portion of that's a defined contribution system. And there seems to be a lot of folks in the legislature that want to see basically all government employees be on a defined contribution system. 401k, that has merits. Just depends on the level of funding. There's pros and cons with that too. You're vested from basically day one, probably year 2 or 3 or 4, but they take it with you. So there's lots of pros and cons. But again, it takes money to do either pay down existing debt, but it also takes money to shut down a plan. And do we have the money? Is it there? Or have we promised it for other things?
Before we change gears here, one of the things that's come up is the notion of a raise for the governor. And it's funny because everybody wants a raise. But when you talk about giving a legislator or a governor a raise, people say, wait a minute. So this whole thing is sorting itself out, too, at this point, I guess.
Are you referring to the State Officers Compensation Commission recommending that the governor and lieutenant governor, attorney general, they get a pay raise? They get a raise, Supreme Court justices, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I guess we'll see where that goes. I noticed they didn't put a pay raise in for the legislators.
They didn't. In fact, one of the stories I read about that was there was too much political capital in that one. So that one was left out.
Yeah, potentially so. People probably don't remember that the legislators were making in the low $80,000. Yeah. Probably 8 or 10 years ago, and all took a haircut when the budget went down, and it just never came back. So.
Yeah, then the governor was part of that too. The governor's
exactly.
Pay was lowered,
everybody took a cut, and nobody puts a gun to your head to run for the legislatures.
Yeah, that's right. That's true. Part of your, if not all of your professional work has been focused on issues of real estate appraising and things of that nature. And so you're intimately familiar with that process. And you've been looking at an issue of that nature as it relates to property taxes, particularly when homes change hands. What have you been working on?
Well, it's a state real estate Transfer Tax Act. It levies on the seller of a home 3/4 of the sale price that gets paid into the state of Michigan. We passed a law last year that said if your state equalized value is equal to or less when you sell a home than when you bought it, in other words, you didn't make any money or you lost money on your home, you shouldn't have the privilege of paying a transfer tax and losing value in your house.
My hand's in the air right now.
Okay. All right.
Happened to me, yeah.
I can attest to that. But what we omitted then was the fact that folks build homes, they buy a lot, they build a home, and then they lose money on it. And so they would be in a position, again, having to pay a tax on the privilege of losing money on your house.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Right.
The new bill I got just essentially adds new construction to the law. So folks said, again, we hope we don't get into a situation where that's happening. I can still see it perhaps happening in certain pockets. But, of course, we never thought values were ever going to go down. They are always going to go up. That was just a given. Well, guess what? They didn't. So we just want to be prepared if we have another downturn in the housing market. Again, people don't pay a tax on losing value in the property. So.
All right. Hindsight is 20/20. We learn from these things, hopefully, right? You're on the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. We've talked about that in the past. We've also talked about certainly concerns about invasive species. You're working on something in that regard, too.
Well, there's a study out that the Corps of Engineers has indicated they were going to release late February, and they haven't released it yet. And it has to do with the Brandon Road lock and dam interface between all of the stuff coming up the Chicago waterway and our Great Lakes. And I've got a resolution we're going to be taking a look at this week on the Executive Committee of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus to simply ask the President to please release a study. I mean, I consider it a ticking time bomb every day we wait and not know what we can do to keep especially the Asian carp out. But I'm sure there's another host of invasives. But, keeping the Asian carp out ought to be a major, major emphasis. And to have reports sitting around or perhaps being massaged somewhere, I don't think we're doing ourselves any favor. So I'd like to see that released. Let's see what it says. They had 2 years to work on it. I want to know what it says.
And by virtue of that report, we can then decide what kind of attack we might have to have here to deal with it.
Oh, exactly. What kind of safeguards do we need to put in place, and what needs to be done? But again, they've had it for 2 years. They've been working on it. The report's sitting somewhere. I'd like to see it released so we know what it says, so we can start taking action today.
And by massaged, you're suggesting there's a potential there that the outcome or the report itself and its results could be massaged in order to try and downplay what kind of emergency there might be.
I'm not sure what the cause is. Maybe massage might have been too strident a term, but I mean it's there, it's out there.
Let's see it.
The public tax dollars paid for it. The Corps of Engineers has it. Let's just see what it says and let the chips fall where they may. But we have to make sure, absolutely sure, that we're not going to let those carp into our Great Lakes.
And this was a report that was held up by the previous administration?
No. Well, it was again, it was slated earlier in the year, said that we'll have this out by February. I can't remember, it was 28th or somewhere towards the end of February. And now we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it. We're May. Let's see what it says. I mean, they've worked on it, and the public ought to know what's in it. So.
Does the national delegation at all, senators and representatives, have any influence?
I've seen some letters from some of the Great Lakes legislators asking just, what's in it. Let's see it. I mean, it's just a document. Let's see what the recommendations are. He spent 2 years on it. So we just hope that this may help a little bit to raise the profile, nudge it a bit, see what we can do. But, of course, that comes on the backs of the total cut in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. $300 million in the administration's budget. So, cutting that out, that's the match money for folks to do pollution issues and invasive species control projects and things like that. So, it's not just a Great Lakes issue; it's a national issue, and we certainly want to see that money restored as it winds its way through the federal budget process, which is very complicated.
Yes, and one influences the other, we presume, if this report does or does not come out. All right, Representative Dave Maturen, thank you, sir. We'll check in next month.
My pleasure. Thank you.